Welcome to another deep dive, and today we're plunging into a world that's both ancient and incredibly relevant to us today, the world of sponges.
Sponges. Over 500 million years they've been around. And they're not just simple blobs.
Yeah.
They're not. They've developed some really incredible adaptations to thrive, to really thrive in their environment. I think knowing your interest in zoology and all things natural sciences, I think you'll find their story fascinating.
Okay, you've got me intrigued. I have to admit, I don't know much about sponges beyond, bath time.
Right.
So what makes them so fascinating from a zoological perspective?
Well, let's start with a specific example. The Venus's flower basket, this deep sea sponge. It's known for its very intricate glass-like skeleton.
Wait, glass skeleton. I'm picturing something incredibly fragile,
Yeah,
like super delicate.
you would think, right. But it's remarkably strong.
Really?
Yeah, it's composed of silica,
Great.
which is, the same material that makes up glass. But the structure is incredibly efficient.
So how does a glass skeleton provide strength? I'm really curious about the mechanics of it.
It's all about the architecture. The skeleton is formed by these tiny interconnected spicules, which are like microscopic building blocks.
Okay.
And Harvard professor Joanna Eisenberg, she's studied these structures extensively, and her research has shown that they outperform even some modern engineering designs in terms of strength and flexibility.
Wow. So they're like tiny underwater architects
Yes.
building these incredible structures.
Yeah.
But why glass? Why build such an intricate structure out of glass, especially in a harsh environment like the deep sea?
That's a great question, and scientists are still, exploring all the possibilities. One theory is that the structure helps with water flow, allowing the sponge to efficiently filter food particles from the surrounding water. Another really fascinating aspect is that the fibers in the skeleton, they have a structure similar to fiber optic cables.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
There's speculation that this might play a role in attracting symbiotic partners like shrimp in the dark depths of the ocean.
Symbiotic partners. So it's not just about structural integrity. There's a whole ecosystem at play within these glass cages.
Absolutely. But before we dive into the fascinating world of sponge symbiosis, let's zoom out for a sec and talk about what makes sponges so unique in the animal kingdom.
Okay, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I still tend to think of sponges as fairly simple creatures.
Okay, well, prepare to have your perceptions challenged.
Right.
One of the most remarkable things about sponges is their ability to regenerate.
Okay.
Scientists have conducted experiments where they break a sponge down to its individual cells.
Wow.
And those cells, get this, they actually reassemble themselves back into a functional sponge.
Wait, seriously? They just come back together like a puzzle. That's incredible.
It is. It's due to the different cell types within a sponge and how they interact. They have specialized cells like choanocytes, also known as collar cells,
Right.
which create currents to bring in food. And amoebocytes, which act like stem cells. They can change and adapt as needed.
So they have this incredible regenerative power, but they're still classified as animals. Seems like a bit of a contradiction.
It might seem that way, but remember, they have specialized cells and they lack cell walls, which solidifies their classification as animals.
Okay. I'm starting to see how complex these creatures really are. It's
Yeah.
not just about being a simple filter feeder. There's a lot going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. And speaking of things happening beneath the surface, did you know that sponges have played a crucial role in developing life-saving medications?
Now that you mention it, I think I've heard something about that.
Well, back in 1945, a scientist, Werner Bergman, he discovered two novel nucleosides, which are, essential building blocks of DNA
Hmm.
in a sponge. And these compounds were later used to develop the first effective drug for treating leukemia.
Wow. So these seemingly simple creatures have been instrumental in the fight against cancer.
Absolutely. And not just cancer. These compounds are still used in antiviral and anti-cancer drugs today. Scientists believe that because sponges are constantly exposed to bacteria, right, and they lack a complex immune system, they've evolved these unique chemical defenses. And these defenses hold enormous potential for medical breakthroughs.
That's incredible. It really highlights the importance of studying and understanding even the smallest and seemingly insignificant creatures in our oceans. They could hold the key to some of our biggest challenges.
I couldn't agree more. But let's not forget about the challenges sponges themselves face.
Okay.
While they might seem defenseless, just sitting there on the ocean floor, they've developed ways to deter most predators.
Deter predators. How do they do that? What kind of defenses do they have?
That's the question. That has scientists captivated right now. What specific substances or toxins are they producing to achieve this level of protection?
So it's a bit of a mystery.
To a certain extent, yeah. We know that most creatures steer clear of them, but there are some fascinating exceptions. Certain sea turtles, for example, and a particular sea star called Oryster reticulatus, also known as the red cushion sea star, they actually prey on sponges.
Red cushion sea star. That name sounds strangely familiar. Why does that ring a bell?
Well, if you're familiar with a certain cheerful yellow sponge and his underwater friends from a popular cartoon, you might recognize this red starfish. It's quite prominent, especially in the Caribbean where many sponges reside.
Oh, of course. Now it makes sense. That's actually pretty funny. I'm starting to get a little nervous for our sponge friend now.
It's all part of the delicate balance, of the ecosystem. But don't worry, sponges have their allies too, and that brings us back to the shrimp we mentioned earlier.
Right, the shrimp partners.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that relationship.
There are certain shrimp species, like the Lysocarcinus. They seek refuge in sponges. The sponges provide protection and even food for these shrimp. However, as the shrimp grow larger, they can become trapped inside, unable to leave. They end up spending their entire lives within the sponge.
So it's a bit of a bittersweet love story, isn't it? They find safety and companionship, but at the cost of their freedom.
In a way, yes, but it's a fascinating example of how interconnected life in the ocean can be. And this brings us back to the Venus's flower basket, which has a special significance in Japanese culture. It's given as a wedding gift, symbolizing lifelong commitment.
A wedding gift. That's a beautiful symbol, considering the shrimp's lifelong dedication to the sponge. It seems like sponges have quite the romantic side.
They do. In Japan, they call it the shrimp friendship shell, and it's seen as this token of enduring partnership and devotion. But let's shift gears now and talk about the practical side of sponges, specifically how they're harvested and the challenges they face in the modern world.
Okay, let's dive into that. I know natural sponges are highly sought after, but I imagine harvesting them must have an impact on the populations.
You're absolutely right. Traditionally, natural sponges have been harvested mainly from the Mediterranean and Caribbean seas,
Okay?
and it's very labor-intensive. Divers collect the sponges by hand, and then they need to be dried and cleaned.
That sounds like a lot of work. It explains why natural sponges can be so expensive.
Precisely. And it's not a new industry either. In Greece, for example, sponges have been harvested for centuries. They were once considered soft gold, a luxury item only affordable to the elite.
So they have a long and rich history. But what about the environmental impact? Can harvesting sponges really be sustainable?
That's the crucial question. Unfortunately, overharvesting and rising sea temperatures have taken their toll on sponge populations both in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. Even though divers, try to leave portions of the sponge behind so it can regenerate, the frequency of harvesting disrupts their natural cycles.
So what can be done to protect these ancient and valuable creatures? Are there any solutions on the horizon?
There are some innovative approaches being explored, like sponge farms. These farms cultivate sponges on nylon ropes, offering a more sustainable way to meet the demand and minimize the environmental impact.
Sponge farms.
Ah.
That's fascinating. So we might be able to enjoy the benefits of natural sponges without harming the delicate ecosystems they inhabit.
That's the hope. It's a relatively new concept, but it shows promise for a more sustainable future for both sponges and the industries that rely on them. But to truly understand the value of sustainable practices, we need to delve deeper into the incredible world of these ancient creatures.
I'm ready to go deeper. I had no idea just how complex and fascinating sponges were. It's amazing to think that something so simple-looking could hold so many secrets and play such a vital role in our world.
It is truly remarkable. And what's even more fascinating is how these creatures, barely changed over millions of years, might hold the key to solving some of humanity's biggest challenges. It really makes you think about what other secrets they might be hiding.
I'm definitely hooked. I can't wait to learn more about these incredible creatures.
Well, let's continue our journey then, shall we? There's still so much to discover about the wonderful world of sponges. It's mind-boggling to think about it for a second. Sponges first appeared about 1 billion years ago. 1 billion. And they're considered Earth's first multicellular animals.
1 billion years ago. Wow. That predates so much of what we think of as life on Earth. I mean, what was the world like back then?
Well, for the first 3 billion years or so, life on Earth was, well, pretty basic. It was just single-celled organisms going about their business. Then somewhere between 1 billion and 800 million years ago, things started to get interesting. Some of these cells, they started to cooperate, forming colonies.
So like a bunch of single-celled roommates deciding to pool their resources?
Exactly. They clumped together, creating these tiny pores, and started waving their flagella in unison. This This created a flow of water through the colony, bringing food right to their doorstep. It was brilliant, really. A passive feeding system, requiring minimal energy.
Talk about efficiency. So they were like living, breathing water filters.
Precisely. And to hold this whole structure together, they developed a soft, elastic material to bind their cells. This is what we know as natural sponge, composed primarily of collagen, which is, similar to gelatin.
So even though some sponges feel, I don't know, hard and rough, they're actually soft and flexible at their core.
Absolutely. They have a wonderful bouncy texture, but some sponges, in their quest for a bit more sturdiness, they incorporated rigid elements into their collagen matrix. These are called spicules.
Spicules. Are those what give some sponges their rough texture?
You got it. These spicules can be made of calcium carbonate, but most are made of silica, essentially glass. Remember the Venus's flower basket we talked about earlier? Those beautiful glass structures are formed by fused spicules.
Well, that makes sense. So those intricate skeletons are the result of millions of years of evolution perfecting their structure for strength and efficiency in the deep sea. It's amazing how these simple organisms have managed to adapt and survive for so long.
It is. And speaking of adapting, the diverse shapes and colors of sponges are a testament to their evolutionary success. Some form, sprawling mats across the seabed, while others grow into chimneys, bottles, or even barrel shapes, adding a splash of color to the underwater landscape. Each shape serves a purpose, helping the sponge thrive in its specific environment.
It's incredible how such seemingly simple organisms can exhibit such a wide array of forms. But you mentioned earlier that sponges weren't always considered animals. Why was there debate about their classification?
Well, for a long time, people thought they were plants.
Yeah.
They're sessile, meaning they stay fixed in one place. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that they were finally recognized as animals, categorized as porifera, which means pore-bearing.
So what convinced scientists to finally classify them as animals? Was their regenerative abilities?
That was a major factor. Remember that experiment we talked about where scientists completely disassembled a sponge and its cells managed to find their way back together?
Right, it's like something out of a science fiction movie.
Exactly. That kind of regeneration is something you wouldn't see in a plant. But there's more to the story. Another key piece of evidence came from observing the behavior of certain sponges. Some species, when exposed to a fluorescent dye, appear to smoke the dye out, showing how they are constantly filtering water.
So they're actively pumping water through their bodies, filtering out food, expelling waste. That definitely sounds more like an animal than a plant.
Indeed. And if you look at the cellular structure of sponges, you find further evidence supporting their animal classification. Unlike the uniform cells of early sponge colonies, modern sponges have differentiated cells that perform specific functions similar to the, muscle cells, nerve cells, and skin cells found in other animals.
So they have a division of labor within their bodies, even without complex organs.
Precisely. They have collar cells, or choanocytes, which are responsible for generating water currents and capturing food particles. Then there are pinacocytes, forming the outer layer, and porocytes, which create the tiny pores that allow water to enter. And let's not forget the archaeocytes, a type of amoebocyte that can differentiate into various cell types, similar to stem cells.
It's amazing how they have this internal organization even without complex organs or systems.
It really is. And crucially, sponge cells lack cell walls, a defining characteristic of animals. This, along with their unique mode of reproduction, solidified their place in the animal kingdom.
Speaking of reproduction,
Mhm.
how do sponges procreate? Is it anything like other marine creatures?
It's similar to corals, but with a fascinating twist. Corals release both sperm and eggs into the water where fertilization happens, externally. Sponges, however, only release sperm. Other sponges containing eggs capture these sperm, so fertilization occurs internally. The fertilized eggs develop into larvae within the sponge before being released into the water to find a suitable spot to settle and grow.
So they have internal fertilization, which is quite unusual for such seemingly simple creatures. Their reproductive strategy is another fascinating adaptation for survival.
It is. So as you can see, classifying sponges as animals, despite their unique characteristics and ancient origins, is a well-founded decision.
Okay, I'm convinced.
Yeah.
They may be strange, but they're definitely animals. And speaking of strange, you mentioned earlier that sponges have some unusual relationships with other creatures. Can you tell me more about that?
Of course. Let's talk about the shrimp that have a particular fondness for a certain type of sponge.
You mean the Venus's flower basket and their shrimp companions? That sounds like a story.
It is. Remember how we talked about the perpetual darkness of the deep sea? Well, For some shrimp, finding food and mates in that gloom can be a real challenge. They stumbled upon these peculiar little glass cages, often covered in edible bits, and realized that, well, living inside provided not only a constant food supply, but also protection from predators.
So it's like they found the perfect underwater condo.
Exactly, and the best part, they wouldn't lose their partners in the darkness. So they decided to make these sponges their permanent home.
But what about their offspring? Do they stay trapped inside too?
That's the interesting part. While the adult shrimp, called Lysocarcinus, become too large to escape the sponge's confines, their offspring, the tiny shrimplets are able to venture out. And guess what? They follow in their parents' footsteps, finding a mate and seeking out a Venus's flower basket to call their own, continuing this unique cycle of cohabitation.
It's an incredible story of adaptation and interdependence. It really adds depth to the Japanese tradition of giving the Venus's flower basket as a wedding gift.
It does, doesn't it? The symbolism of lifelong commitment takes on a whole new meaning when you consider the shrimp's lifelong dedication to their sponge home.
It's amazing how these seemingly simple creatures have evolved such complex relationships. And I think all of this is happening within these intricate glass structures built by these ancient animals.
Speaking of those structures, let's delve a bit deeper into their engineering marvel. We've talked about the strength and efficiency of the Venus's flower basket's skeleton, but there's another fascinating aspect to it, the fiber optic-like structure of its glass fibers.
Fiber optics, you mean like the cables that carry our internet and phone signals?
Precisely. It's incredible, isn't it? Back in 2004, a team from Bell Labs published a study revealing this remarkable characteristic of the Venus's flower basket. They discovered that the glass fibers are layered with a high refractive index core and a low refractive index outer layer.
So they're essentially natural fiber optic cables.
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing. But how do they create these structures at the bottom of the ocean?
That's the truly amazing part. While humans require intense heat, often exceeding 1500 degrees Celsius to manufacture glass sponges, have developed a completely different method. They utilize their cells to manipulate molecules, extracting silica from seawater, and crafting glass at ambient temperatures.
So they've mastered a technology that we've only recently developed,
Yeah.
and they're doing it without any fancy equipment or high temperatures.
It's a testament to the power of natural selection and the ingenuity of evolution. And what's even more impressive is that the glass they produce is less brittle and more resilient than our man-made versions.
That's incredible. It sounds like we could learn a thing or two from these ancient architects. But what's the purpose of these fiber optic-like structures? Why would a sponge need them?
That's a question researchers are still trying to fully understand. One hypothesis is that these fibers might play a role in attracting those symbiotic shrimp partners we talked about. The deep sea is home to many bioluminescent creatures, and these glass fibers might be able to collect and transmit light, creating glowing points that guide the shrimp towards their potential home.
So it's like they're putting out a welcome mat, using light to attract their desired tenants.
Precisely. It makes the relationship even more fascinating, doesn't it? They've evolved together, each benefiting from the other's presence.
It's a perfect example of symbiosis. But I'm curious, not all sponges live in the deep sea. What about the sponges that live in shallower waters? Don't they have some interesting relationships too?
They do. In fact, there's a particular type of crab that has a rather unique relationship with sponges.
Oh, I think I've heard of them. Are they the ones that carry sponges on their backs?
You're thinking of sponge crabs. They have this fascinating behavior of cutting pieces of sponge and attaching them to their shells. It's primarily for camouflage, helping them blend in with their surroundings and avoid predators.
Oh, it's like they're wearing a living suit of armor. But isn't that harmful to the sponge?
Not at all. The sponge fragment actually remains alive and continues to grow, eventually forming a new, complete sponge. In a way, it's beneficial for the sponge, too, as it gets transported to new locations, expanding its range.
It's like a win-win situation. The crab gets camouflage, and the sponge gets free transportation. It reminds me of a certain cartoon character who might just have been inspired by this very relationship.
A certain yellow sponge, who happens to be quite mobile despite his lack of limbs.
Exactly. I wonder if the creators of that show were inspired by the sponge crab.
It's certainly a possibility, but while that connection might be a bit speculative, there's a more concrete link between the sponge world and a certain red starfish that might ring a bell.
Oh, you mean the red cushion sea star that preys on sponges. We talked about that earlier.
The very same. Now, as we discussed, most sea stars don't have a taste for sponges, but this particular species, scientifically known as Oryster reticulatus, seems to have a special appetite for them.
And you said the sea star is quite common in the Caribbean, right? Where a lot of sponges live.
That's right. Dr. Janie Wolf, a sponge expert from Florida State University, published a study back in 1995 documenting this unusual feeding behavior. She found that in areas where these red starfish were present, sponge populations were significantly depleted.
So they're like little sponge eating machines.
In a way, yes. And here's the interesting part. They seem to prefer sponges over other food sources. When hurricanes bring in debris, including sponge fragments from other areas, these starfish will prioritize consuming the sponges over other readily available food.
That's a very specific palate.
Eh.
And this is making me think of another cartoon character, one who happens to be best friends with a certain yellow sponge.
You're not suggesting that.
I am. A red starfish, a sponge-eating enthusiast. It's all starting to make sense.
Well, that's certainly a fun connection to make. I can't confirm whether the cartoon creators were inspired by this specific sea star, but the resemblance is uncanny, isn't it?
It is. It just goes to show that even in cartoons, there's often a kernel of truth rooted in the fascinating world of nature. But let's get back to the real world for a moment and talk about the remarkable contributions sponges have made to the field of medicine. We've already touched upon the life-saving drugs derived from certain sponge compounds, but the story doesn't end there.
You're absolutely right. The medical potential of sponges is truly vast. Remember those two novel nucleosides, the building blocks of DNA, that were discovered back in 1945?
The ones that led to the development of the first effective leukemia treatment.
Precisely. Those compounds, extracted from a sponge called Tictatethia crypta, revolutionized cancer treatment. But their significance goes beyond just leukemia. These compounds, known as spongathimidine and sponguridine, are still used today as the basis for numerous antiviral and anti-cancer drugs.
So they're not just historical breakthroughs, they're still relevant in modern medicine.
Absolutely. Their discovery marked a turning point in our understanding of how to combat diseases at the cellular level. And it highlights the incredible potential of marine organisms as sources of novel pharmaceuticals.
It's like they're tiny pharmaceutical factories, producing compounds that we could never have imagined.
That's a great way to put it. And scientists believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because sponges are constantly filtering massive amounts of seawater, they're exposed to countless bacteria and other potential threats, yet they lack a sophisticated immune system like ours.
So how do they protect themselves from all those pathogens?
That's the million-dollar question. They must have developed unique defense mechanisms to survive in such a hostile environment. And those mechanisms could hold the key to unlocking even more medical breakthroughs.
So sponges are not only ancient architects and symbiotic partners, but also potential lifesavers.
Mm-hmm.
It's truly amazing how much we can learn from these seemingly simple creatures.
I completely agree. They challenge our preconceived notions about complexity and intelligence in the animal kingdom.
And to think for the longest time, we've primarily used them for bathing.
That's right. Speaking of bathing, have you ever wondered why natural sponges are so expensive?
I have. They're definitely a luxury item.
Well, there are a few reasons for their high price tag. First and foremost, harvesting natural sponges is incredibly labor-intensive. Divers have to go down to the ocean floor and carefully collect them by hand.
So there's a significant amount of human effort involved.
Exactly. And then there's the processing involved. Once the sponges are brought to the surface, they need to be cleaned and dried. Remember all those specialized cells we talked about? They need to be removed, leaving only the collagen framework behind.
So it's not just about collecting them. There's a whole art to preparing them for use.
Precisely. The traditional method involves drying the sponges in the sun to kill the cells and then repeatedly rinsing them in seawater. This process is crucial for ensuring the quality of the sponge.
And I imagine the location of the sponge beds also factors into the cost.
You're absolutely right. The two main sponge-producing regions are the Mediterranean Sea and the Caribbean Sea, and both are, well, quite a distance from many major markets.
So transportation costs add up too. But I've heard that Mediterranean sponges are considered superior to Caribbean sponges. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it's a bit of a debate within the sponge industry. The Mediterranean, specifically Greece, has a long and storied history of sponge harvesting. Dating back to the times of Plato and Aristotle, They were once considered a luxury item, hence the nickname soft gold, only affordable to the elite.
So they have a prestigious heritage.
Indeed, and some argue that the colder waters of the Mediterranean result in slower growing, denser sponges, leading to a higher quality product. Caribbean sponges, on the other hand, grow faster due to warmer water temperatures, and some believe this compromises their quality.
So it's all about the density and texture.
To a certain extent, yes, but ultimately it comes down to personal preference. However, there's a more pressing issue facing both Mediterranean and Caribbean sponges, regardless of their perceived quality.
You're talking about the declining sponge populations, right?
Right. Unfortunately, yes. Overharvesting has taken its toll, even with divers attempting to leave portions of the sponge behind for regeneration. And the added stress of rising sea temperatures further threatens these delicate ecosystems.
So what's being done to address this issue? Are there any efforts to ensure the survival of these incredible creatures?
There are. One promising approach is the development of sponge farms, which involve cultivating sponges on nylon ropes. It's a more controlled and sustainable method of production, reducing the pressure on wild populations.
That's encouraging. So there might be a way to enjoy the benefits of natural sponges without jeopardizing their future.
Exactly. And it's not just about the luxury market. Remember how we talked about the environmental impact of synthetic sponges?
The fact that they take decades to decompose and contribute to microplastic pollution.
Precisely. If we can successfully cultivate natural sponges on a larger scale, we can offer a viable alternative to these environmentally harmful synthetic products.
That would be a significant step towards reducing our reliance on plastics and protecting our oceans.
It would. And it all starts with understanding and appreciating the incredible value of these ancient and often overlooked creatures.
This has been an eye-opening journey. From ancient architects to symbiotic partners, from medical marvels to sustainable alternatives, sponges are far more complex and fascinating than I ever imagined.
I know. It's amazing how much wonder and potential these simple-looking creatures hold.
But before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one last aspect of the sponge world that I'd like to explore.
Oh, what else have these fascinating creatures got up their sleeves?
Let's talk about their defense mechanisms. We've touched upon the fact that sponges deter most predators, but what exactly are their secrets to survival? Let's talk about their defense mechanisms. We've touched upon the fact that sponges deter most predators, but what exactly are their secrets to survival?
Well, that's a question that scientists are still actively investigating.
So it is a bit of a mystery.
To a certain extent, yes. But we do have some intriguing clues. We know that most marine creatures, they just avoid eating sponges, which, suggests they possess some form of chemical defense.
So they're not just passively sitting there, they're actively deterring potential predators.
Exactly. They've evolved over millions of years to produce compounds that make them, well, unpalatable or even toxic to other organisms.
That makes sense. It's like they're saying, don't even think about taking a bite.
Precisely. And these chemical defenses are of great interest to scientists, not just for understanding sponge ecology, but also for their potential applications in medicine and other fields.
So those same compounds that protect sponges from predators could also hold the key to new drugs or materials.
That's the exciting possibility. Remember how we talked about the nucleosides that revolutionized cancer treatment? Those were discovered in a sponge that was, well, basically trying to defend itself from something in its environment.
It's incredible to think that these seemingly simple creatures have such a complex arsenal of chemical weapons at their disposal. It really highlights the incredible diversity and ingenuity of life in our oceans.
I completely agree. And it's a reminder that we've only scratched the surface of what there is to discover. There are countless species of sponges out there, each with its own unique set of adaptations and survival strategies.
And each potentially holding secrets that could benefit humanity in ways we haven't even imagined yet.
Exactly. Sponges are a testament to the power of evolution, the interconnectedness of life, and the boundless potential of the natural world.
This deep dive into the world of sponges has been a truly eye-opening experience. I've learned so much about their incredible resilience, their symbiotic relationships, their contributions to medicine, and the challenges they face in a changing world.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you. I hope it's sparked a sense of wonder and appreciation for these often overlooked creatures.
It certainly has. And I think it's safe to say that sponges, despite their simple appearance, are anything but simple. They're complex, adaptable, and full of surprises.
Couldn't have put it better myself. And who knows what other secrets they hold. Perhaps one day we'll unravel the mysteries of their chemical defenses, unlock the full potential of their biomedical applications, and learn even more from their ancient wisdom.
That's an exciting thought. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the endless possibilities of the sponge world. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning the world around you.